Okay, so today's subject is something I have strong views on, and I haven't spoken about this one for a while, so I want to kind of update some of my reflections on this. I want to talk about the issue of the influence of the media, and I am using that general term, the media, on politics and society. I think it is absolutely profound. Um, The reason I said I'm using the general term is not because I believe that every single journalist is morally corrupt. I certainly don't believe that. Um, and I do have preferences with some networks, some newspapers over others. So I'd be lying if I said I didn't. Nevertheless, there is something that has permeated the media as a whole, which is utterly indisputable. I always think back to President Johnson. I believe it was 1966. Not sure about the exact date, but sometime around the mid 60s. And he said to a journalist, "You have changed everything." He didn't mean that individual. He meant the industry has changed everything. The 60s was a transformative decade because that is when I would argue, for a start, yellow journalism really came to the forefront. I mean, it's always existed in some form or another. Even going back to the 18th century, we had a sort of form of yellow journalism, or as it's better known in the UK, tabloid esque journalism, red top journalism. I think, by the way, it's called red top simply because the font is usually in red. At least it is in the UK. But that goes way back to the 18th century, some of the satire that was around then. So it probably has its origins back then. Nevertheless, it wasn't until about the 1960s that this really came glaringly to the forefront. Um, and in a very profound way. I would argue from about the 60s onwards, and thinking of the context of the UK, it was under Harold Wilson's premiership that everything really started to change. That's why he had such a turbulent premiership, one reason. Because Wilson was a very clever man and he knew how to handle the media, but um, even he was under enormous strain from the sort of changes that were going on, in my opinion. Um, and the changes were utterly profound. The reason I go back to the 60s is that is when in the UK the Sun newspaper was launched. Um, in its current format in 1969, and it's Britain's most famous tabloids. We have others as well. I I would love to say that there is a media outlet or a newspaper that is genuinely neutral in its views, but I really don't think that exists. In the UK, the independent newspaper has long tried to present itself as a centrist or a neutral newspaper, but they unquestionably have a more left wing bias. To be fair, they are more centrist than the Guardian. That I think that is fair to say. But what I'm getting at, what I'm driving at with this is, I think it is impossible for any media outlet or any newspaper to be truly neutral. It just doesn't exist. I am yet to see that. Now, I have some advantage with this because we have satellite TV and we have access to a number of networks around the world. This includes Sky News, the BBC, BBC Parliament, CNN, um, Fox News, NDTV, New Delhi Television, Al Jazeera, Russia Today, um, CCTV, CCTV 9 to be precise. It's a English language Chinese network, and CCTV, which is another English language Chinese network. We used to have a few more, but they're gone now. But the point is, I have got access to these major networks around the world, so I get an insight very often when I keep a journal of news events going on in the world. It partly helps me prepare for these videos, but just writing out my thoughts. And I get a pretty good insight into the sort of message that these networks are pushing out. So I can make statements about any of these networks, but I'm going to narrow it down to just a few. BBC, CNN, and Fox. So probably the ones I watch most often. Oh, another one was France 24. I quite like France 24, although I don't know watch it enough to say whether it's left wing or right wing. But um, yeah, there's no question about it that there is a bias in all these networks. And in the UK, the power of the tabloid press is immense. It can literally make or break governments. The power of news media on the screen, I think, is slightly less. In the US, it's probably the other way around. I'm sure there are American tabloids, but there's no national US tabloid I can think of. I know there's regional tabloids, but I can't think of any national American tabloid. What seems to be the case in the US is news media, predominantly CNN and Fox. Um, Right wingers believe that CNN has a liberal bias. Left wingers or liberals believe that Fox has a conservative bias. The truth is, both are right. Both of those networks are fiercely biased. I have to laugh when Fox News, for example, says we're fair and balanced. No, you're not. You have an obvious right wing bias. And I think they make themselves look foolish by trying to deny that. The CNN has a liberal bias, there's no question about it. As a centrist, I find sometimes I'm watching these networks and sometimes I'm okay. I'm just watching it and taking in information and, disagreeing with a lot of what's being said, agreeing with some things that are being said. But the point I'd like to make is when you get the media that is so powerful, there is a sort of moral corruption going on insofar as there is this vindictive attitude among many of the journalists involved. And I want to be very careful with this because I don't want to attack each and every reporter, journalist involved in these networks. But there is unquestionably something going on which kind of leads people to think that there is an agenda here. What I mean by that is journalists today in print media and in news media are utterly obsessed by trying to expose politicians, by trying to put them on the spot, gotcha moments, as I would call it. Now, in Western countries, we have a very, very deep belief in freedom of the press. And this is something I really do believe in, because without freedom of the press, you have a situation like China, where the ruling government controls everything. That's clearly problematic, because then you're only hearing one point of view. But I do often think that in Western democracies, one big fault that we have is that the media goes way too far. They've got too much freedom insofar as they can distort on a massive scale and get away with it. The reason I say distort and not lie is because they're clever. They're clever enough to not to make outright lies. So most of what they say probably has some basis in fact. But the problem is they do it in such a way as to get their political agenda coming through. They'll say that they're just the messengers. I strongly disagree with that. They're far more than messengers. They are directly influencing the way people think in society. We cannot underestimate this. You know, there was a time when the news media's purpose was supposed to be holding those in power to account and reporting the news. But at some point, that has morphed into powerful people in the media going out of the way to set their own agenda. And basically, it's almost like politicians are on strings with these people. I believe that the media is far more powerful than any politician. And some would say that's the way it should be. To be clear, I don't believe that any politician should be more powerful than the media. But I do think it's problematic when you have a situation the media is so powerful that they can distort on a massive basis and pretty much get away with it. Now, one aspect of the Trump campaign has been his ongoing rows with the media, and for me, this is kind of like I'm between a rock and a hard place because I'm very critical of Trump. Can't stand the man. On the other hand, I cannot stand the likes of Fox News. So I sort of part of me grudgingly likes the fact he's standing up to them. Um, Here in the UK, it's very, very difficult for politicians to stand up to the print media because if they do, I guarantee the next day they will be utterly slandered. They will be, an example is leading up to the 2015 election, the leader of the Labour Party, Ed Miliband, was ruthlessly smeared over the most ridiculous of things. It wasn't a policy area, it was how he was eating a bacon sandwich. Yes, you heard that correct. How he was eating a bacon sandwich because it was a slightly unflattering photo. So, what the Sun done is use this to constantly ridicule a man. This shows just how nasty and vindictive and frankly bullying these tabloids are. And I would like to say that my compatriots are more intelligent than buying into that crap, but I hate to say there are people out there that frankly, and this might sound whatever, but there are people out there who are stupid enough to look at that and actually form their opinion of Ed Miliband based on that. Now, to be fair, the left wing tabloids probably do the same thing to David Cameron, like caricature him constantly as a toff and so on. So, my point is the print media has a hell of a lot to answer for in terms of distorting how the public perceives someone. I do like there was one moment during the general election where Ed Miliband said to Jeremy Paxman, who's not a tabloid journalist, but he's a very powerful journalist in the BBC, and he was basically Ed Miliband basically said, "Hell yes, I'm tough enough." And Jeremy, this election for the British people, not for you or me. That was very clever on the part of Miliband because what he was saying was he was taking away the ego from a media personality for once. And Paxman's one of the most notorious examples. It's the same when I look at CNN pundits, when I look at Fox pundits discussing the incoming results, they go far beyond just analysing the results. They're driven, their egos are just as big as Donald Trump's. It's just that they're not running for president. And these are people who love the sound of their own voice and they love to absolutely ultra analyze every little thing the candidates say. Now, look, to be clear, I have no problem with scrutiny of people running for president. That is important, obviously, but it is problematic when you get to a situation whereby the media is controlling everything, and that is really the impression that I get from the situation in my country and in the US, and I imagine it's similar in Canada and other Western countries. Not so much in France, I have to say, because the French have more respect for privacy of the individual. Germany, I don't know that much about Germany, but I know their Bild tabloid is extremely powerful. It's the German equivalent of the Sun, and it has a bigger circulation. The Bild, like Sun, is total trash. Um, there are times I feel deeply, deeply angry at what is blatantly going on. And the truth is, foolish people who don't want to look a bit deeper into the issues will blindly believe everything they read in the tabloids. Now, I don't believe in the alternative of sort of conspiracy theory channels, as I would call them. And I know that sounds sort of like I'm deriding them, but the problem with the likes of the Alex Jones show, InfoWars, and that sort of thing is on one hand, what they're doing can be seen as noble because they're standing up to the power of mass media, but on the other hand, they take conspiracies to the point of all beyond all reason, where anything and everything is a conspiracy. Now, I think that to me demonstrates that people are getting desperate and they're so fed up with the mass media that they're then resorting to the other extreme of believing nonsense. I think that's what is happening. That's why Alex Jones, for example, has a lot of online support because he presents himself as a little guy standing up to this big powerful mass media, and the problem is that angle is also problematic because when you start believing any conspiracy theory that anything goes, then what do we have left? The thing is, people say, oh, if you want to get information about the world around you, don't listen to the mass media. I don't quite agree with that because there's distortion going on, but there is no other source. People say find out for yourself, but look, if you're sitting in the UK or the US, what other way do you have to know about Syria unless you go there? And obviously, that's not practical unless you're a jihadist or an aid worker. It's so I don't quite agree that the only way you can know about an event or the only way you should know about an event is by going and finding out yourself. Firstly, there's the fact that it's sometimes too dangerous to do so, but When I'm critical of the mass media, I stand by everything you've said, but that doesn't mean that everything they're saying is wrong. So we also need to be level headed about this. We need to be wary of the power of mass media, but we also have to not go to the other extreme of thinking that it's all lies, because it's not. And I don't think there's a contradiction in what I'm saying, because I am very, very wary of the power of mass media, and it deeply frustrates me sometimes. But I don't want a situation where it's like, oh, the BBC, CNN, Fox are all lying outright. Because then you start to get into like, basically, you become a very bitter, isolated sort of individual, and you think the whole world is out to get you. That is the sort of thinking that you get into when you start believing that traction of thinking, and it's just as problematic. It's much less of a threat, but it is just as problematic. So what we need to do is just get into a sort of middle approach of common sense. In other words, don't blindly believe everything that they're saying, because they make mistakes, and sometimes, very often, they outright distort, and there is blatant bias on all sides. So what we need to do is try and look at it objectively. I mean, what I do is I look at different networks, so I form my views based on different sources, not all on one source. And I appreciate not everyone has that advantage because not everyone has access to these different networks. But what I would say is if you only have access to one of these networks, I'm not saying don't believe what they're saying, but all I'm saying is bear in mind that there is a bias there and there will always be a bias there. Um, every media outlet has an agenda. There's no question about that. And politicians in Western countries have a much tougher job than they do in authoritarian regimes. And don't get me wrong, I'm not advocating authoritarian regimes, but I am making the point that politicians, they cannot just campaign and present their policies. They're constantly having to defend ruthless media onslaughts about their character. Their character is important, but I also believe that it's a vicious trigger effect or a vicious circle because politicians are put into a corner whereby they have to be seen in a certain way. And this comes back to the video I was making about leadership. When people are pushed into a corner, they will bite back. And that's the problem that we're finding when, people are always cynical about politicians and say, oh, they're all liars, they're all in it for themselves. But the truth is, politicians are put into a position where they're expected to be a certain way. So we need to allow politicians to be natural. Perhaps that's one reason why Donald Trump has got so much support. Because people genuinely do see him as refreshing. But I happen to believe that the sort of rhetoric he is using is dangerous. And I stand by all the criticism I've made of him. But I do understand why he's getting support. Um, and I suspect that is largely for the sort of reasons I'm mentioning. Although to be honest, the media, Trump says the media is out to get him. I don't think that's quite true. Because the interviews I've seen recently, the journalists have been pretty civil to Trump. So, does he really think that they're going to give Bernie Sanders an easy ride? I don't think so. Certainly not Fox News. And for their part, CNN are probably going to go out of their way to try and demolish the character of right wing politicians. So there's bias on both sides. The BBC has long been accused of having a left wing bias, and they do have a left wing bias. Sky News, on the other hand, blatantly has a right wing bias. It's pretty much like, broadly speaking, the BBC is CNN, Sky is Fox, although the BBC is a lot older than any of these networks. But anyway, I'm going to leave it here. All I would say as a final thought, those in the media need to understand that they cannot call all the shots. And they need to stop being driven by their own ego and just do their jobs. Because I think a lot of people are fed up with how they are, in a sense, hijacking democracy. That does sound like a strong statement, but I really believe that. I believe the power of mass media is essentially hijacking democracy because in our democratic systems, what must come first is that those elected represent the people all that elected them. Now, when you have this middleman, which is the media, manipulating and distorting what is going on, which they very often do, that is deeply problematic. I mean, when in the UK, I'll give an example. And I didn't buy this, by the way, I got it free. just in case anyone's wondering. The Sun today. Queen backs Brexit. Well, this headline has already proven to be false. They've got this plastered over the cover. Queen backs Brexit. So it immediately puts the head of state in a position where she is backing a major political issue. Firstly, that would be unconstitutional. Not that we have a written constitution, but in our various documents, it would be unconstitutional for the head of state to back a specific political decision. Nick Clegg has robustly denied this, and I'm more inclined to believe Nick Clegg than the Sun. Not saying that Nick Clegg's the most honest person in the world, but this is an example where they take rumours and present it as fact, and it's dangerous because that is blatantly designed to coerce royalists into backing Brexit. That is an example of what I'm talking about. This headline is based on rumours, not fact, and it happens all the time. So that's a few of my thoughts. This is a very, very critical issue. Yes, we need media that is free from political interference. I understand that. But the media, for their part, need to tone down their arrogance and their own ego and realize that they cannot call all the shots. Their job is to hold the powerful to account and to report the news, not to make the news. And that is what they've been doing for a very long time. And we need to be very vigilant of it.